What's good, everybody? Today we're talking about technique and its relation to chasing strength. I understand there's a lot of new people on the channel now. The first thing that I want to get into is defining what does this mean? What is chasing strength and what is technique? I want to be very clear about this, one, for the new people, and two, just so you can actually have the best understanding of this video as you can. This isn't going to be so much talking about the downsides of chasing strength. It's going to be complemented by the upsides of actually refining your technique. And I want to tell you why you actually should prioritize technique and why it's important. So you can't just, I'm not just going to tell you, don't chase strength, go chase hypertrophy. I want to go a little bit deeper and give you at least a general start to what technique actually is and the role it plays in muscle building, in the process of it. So chasing strength doesn't mean getting stronger. It means moving strength up your priority list over more important priorities for hypertrophy. So if strength is, say, random number, say it's number 5 on the priority list of hypertrophy variables, that means moving strength up to, say, number 2 or 3 over more important things that will actually get you hypertrophy in the first place. It's an overemphasis, it's an over prioritization of a variable, and it's, in most cases, it's going to be strength because we get distracted by it. And then to dive into technique, technique is one of the most important and overlooked aspects of training. It's more than just form and lift mechanics. It encompasses a few more things. It's a combination of key variables for each lift, including range of motion, tempo, form, and proximity to failure. And there's more to it, but those are a few basics for you to give you an idea of my definition. Chasing strength typically leads one of these variables to be sacrificed. And while you think you're taking a step forward and progressing, you might actually be taking a step backwards. And what do I mean by this? When you chase strength, what happens is most of the time you're sacrificing something else. Because if the training that you're doing isn't causing you to get stronger from that stimulus, you're probably not actually getting stronger. And there's a buffer room between your actual display of strength and the optimal place to be training for hypertrophy. When you start to chase and you get closer to that ceiling by chasing strength, you're not actually getting stronger most of the time. It's like the weight on the bar is going up, or maybe your reps are going up, but it's at the expense of something else like tempo or range of motion, etc. Chasing strength is prioritizing strength at the expense of factors that drive hypertrophy. This is a short-term mindset that leads you away from actually stimulating hypertrophy. So you have important fundamentals that actually build you muscle, and we'll dive into that in a bit. Once you start to chip away from those and break those off, you're building less muscle each session. So in the short term, what I mean by this is, yeah, maybe you can add 5 pounds next week, or maybe you can beat your rep total from last week and add an extra rep. But a lot of the time, if you start to chase that, it's at the expense of something else, as I've been saying this entire video. So what we have to do is avoid that at all costs and let progression happen through the best training that you can do. It's turning a blind eye to an actual issue with your training. Assuming your sleep and your diet are in check and you're getting a reasonable amount of both, it's probably an issue with your training. And most of the time, it's not an issue of you're just happening to not get stronger. There's a reason you're not getting stronger, and it's because there's an issue with your training. So it's better to reflect the variables that create a slow progression through building muscle, and then that strength needs to happen. It's one of those weird things where it's like you have to go into the gym, and there's a certain stimulus that you get from training, and you have to make that the best that you possibly can through a good understanding of training, a well-written, understood, and designed program. And then on top of that, just executing that the best that you can. So when things start to stall out and you're worried you're not progressing week after week, well, you have to look at the lift. Is that lift supposed to be something that progresses week after week? What's the load that you're using on there? Something like a dumbbell curl where you might be using 30, 35 pounds. You're not going to be adding reps every single week forever because that's just not possible. And you can't out-strength improper training because that's just going to lead you to get less and less stimulation from each session, and you're just moving that plateau sooner and sooner, and then you're just going to have to face the issue. So in reality, when you start to chase strength and you start to sacrifice things to just put a little bit more weight or add a rep, you're procrastinating on an actual issue that you have to diagnose in your training, And that plateau is just coming sooner and sooner. You're just moving it shorter and shorter, and then you're going to have to run into that actual issue. It makes more sense just to diagnose things and look at your training now. And this is why I like to talk about training and kind of an art form and actually looking at it as a craft, because it's so much more important. There's so much more to it than just go lift and just get stronger, because you're going to run into issues when you train like that. You have to be methodical with it. You have to understand the basics. So let's dive into some of that. And when you're training for hypertrophy, you're chasing hypertrophy. You're chasing how to get bigger. And this is something that I wrote down on my notes that I do want to share with you guys. You aren't chasing strength. Strength progression is overemphasized. It really is. Stop focusing so much on strength when you don't even have good technique, tempo, range of motion, exercise selection, proximity to failure, etc. There's more than just this. Prioritize and master these variables, and a hypertrophy will happen. It will. There's no way around it. This is the pinnacle of hypertrophy training, and this is why I never plateau. If you watch my training logs that I post actually very infrequently, but if you were to take a look at my program or take a look at my old training logs, it's a night and day difference. My strength levels and performance from, say, January of last year to December of this year. It's night and day. I don't always progress week to week. I fluctuate a lot, but when you look at it in the long term, that's the actual progress that happened in terms of building muscle, and that reflected in my numbers. So when I look back at my old training logs and I was doing overhead extensions with 60 pounds or whatever for 25 reps across 3 sets, and now I'm at 85 pounds for 45 reps. And those are somewhat random numbers, by the way. That's because my triceps got bigger, and that's a reflection of that. I didn't just chase that. That happened because my training was solid. I had a really good technique, and that, when I say technique, I mean everything. That's range of motion, a good proximity to failure, high effort. It's things like this, and that's what built me muscle. In the past, when I've tried to just add 5 pounds when I shouldn't be, or trying to cheat just to get more reps and think that's progressive overload, that's when I plateaued and ran into a wall. And then when that happened, I would just rotate lifts, try something else, and then of course it didn't work, and now I'm at my genetic limit, right? So there's hypertrophy training is more complex than you think. It's complex, but it's simple at the same time. It's a strange thing to understand. What I want you to know is that understanding the basics is pretty easy to get down, but you have to keep learning. You have to keep learning. That's one of the most important things. I'm still learning these, and I've been lifting for years. Like, there's still stuff that I can improve on. And as soon as you stop learning a little bit more and trying to perfect your technique in all aspects, that's when you start to plateau a little bit. In my mind, the pinnacle of hypertrophy training is being able to allow the strength to happen and the progression to happen passively. You want to create the most stimulus and the most hypertrophy from each session, that you don't have to actually look at your training logs. You don't have to look at your numbers, because they just happen naturally. You should still be checking them. I still check mine every now and then just to make sure everything's going well, making sure there's no lifts that I'm leaving behind. But when you learn how to train each lift and each muscle group hard, there's not much more you can do. There's no fancy progression model. There's no fancy way of progressively overloading and adding volume in certain waves and whatnot that are going to break you through plateaus when you're not actually training hard enough. It all comes down to your day-by-day training, and that's what causes progression and progressive overload to actually happen. And if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that I can't stand the advice of just get stronger or just put more weight on the bar. It's things like this: just train hard. The reality of that advice is it's people that they either, one, don't feel like giving actual advice, so they just say that, or they're complete beginners where they're just like, they think that progressive overload and just adding weight on the bar is all that there is to muscle building. And I mean, it's a start. It's better than nothing. But in reality, that's just pushing the plateau back a few months, maybe a year. Like, you're not going to get much out of that. You're going to have a average physique, and you're not going to be satisfied with it. I can say that 100%. I've been there. I've trained people like that. I've seen my friends do that too. Nobody's satisfied training like that. This is a channel where I'm putting out the best advice that I possibly can. I want to give you the advice that will lead you to never plateau. I want you guys to be able to train the way I do. I'm not trying to put myself on a high horse here, but this is years of just prioritizing lifting, and reflecting and thinking critically about it and observing others, training other people, all put into my mind, where I've been able to come up with these plans and these training methods that can keep you going and building muscle forever. And that's why I have the channel. Like, I take this stuff seriously and I think about it critically. I want you guys to be able to do the same. Like, let's up the standards a little bit. I know everybody out there watching this video is capable of going much farther than you think you can. Take time to learn your methods. I don't want you guys to just take mine and copy and paste it to your program. I want you to see where you're at. Try and actually understand these methods. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to use them, but try and understand them. See if it works with you. See if it works. Basically what I'm trying to say. And there are cases where, to go back to the getting stronger thing, there are cases where you can get stronger, not necessarily get bigger. There's a few different examples of this, but what happens here is some lifts just aren't that good for hypertrophy. They really aren't, and that's okay, but we just have to understand that. The best example I can think of is, say, the Olympic lifts. Are they going to put on a little bit of muscle? Like, sure. But in general, there's not enough time under tension. There's not enough stress on a particular muscle to actually grow from a lift like that. And that's kind of a happy medium example, because nobody actually uses those for hypertrophy. But then you take something like a competition style squat, bench, and deadlift. I mean, I see guys on Instagram deadlifting with the most optimized technique for strength, deadlifting 800 plus pounds that they don't even look like they lift. And it's because that's just a shitty lift for hypertrophy. And we have to have nuance with this and understand that, yeah, some lifts might be fun and they might look cool and you can put up a lot of weight, but if it's not stimulating for anything in terms of hypertrophy, you can get as strong as you want, but you're not actually going to get much bigger from that. So let's dive into a few more examples of how some of these issues actually occur in our training. I think the first one, I kind of already touched on it. It's poor exercise selection. So the first example of this would be lifts that display strength and typically put you in an overly advantageous leverage, which is going to be bad for hypertrophy. So say the sumo deadlift, competition style bench. Sure, you can keep progressing on these and keep getting stronger, but you'd be surprised and you'll be very disappointed at how little you actually get back in terms of muscle gains. And people call these are the big lifts. There's the big hitters, the prioritized movements. They're the centerpiece of every program out there, but you'd be disappointed at how poor they actually work in terms of hypertrophy. So what you want to do is put yourself in a mechanical disadvantage, bias the muscle. You want to fail because one muscle is being biased and that muscle can't do much more. You can expect that muscle to grow very well. The other muscles, if they grow a little bit from it, that's just a little bonus, but don't expect that. Have your program revolved around each muscle group, not each lift. And then number two, another example of poor exercise selection is easy isolation lifts. And this is that accessory mindset that I can't stand. This is one of the worst mindsets you can fall into for hypertrophy. So in this way, you can still have a good lift, but you just mess it up so bad that it's now useless. Like take something like a tricep push down, where people don't actually get any stretch. The advice that I got when I first started lifting was you don't have to go past 90 degrees on a push down. You just go up to here and just push down. You do that with perfectly strict form. It's just an afterthought. You always put it as the last lift in your program. It's things like this, where you have a potential for a good lift and you just mess it up so bad that it's now almost worthless. That's a big issue. Another one would be insufficient range of motion to push off this last point. And primarily, this is going to be a lack of stretch. And this is something that, with the more experience that I get, the more I realize how important this is. The lifts where I kind of half-ass the range of motion, so like even squats for me, where I was squatting, like I was repping out 405, but my knees never really broke much past 90 degrees and my quads didn't really grow from it. So yeah, I progressed on my squats for like 3 years pretty rapidly, but I didn't really get anything out of it. And I was disappointed, and I grew resentful of lifting. I thought I was at my natural limit and I quit lifting. And I might be kind of an extreme case, but the way that these beliefs are put out there and this advice is put out there will lead a lot of people down that path. And It's pretty sad. So range of motion, getting a good stretch, the more experience that I get and the more that I learn about this stuff, the more I realize how important that actually is. So focus on range of motion. Yes, you're going to be weaker. Yes, it's going to be a hit to your ego, 100%. When I started doing overhead tricep extensions with a full range of motion, not just halfway down and then right back up, I was using a significantly less amount of weight. I was probably using 30-40% less weight on those than I was when I was just kind of going heavy and doing those what I thought were full reps, full range of motion at the time. Even though I was training them to failure, my arms didn't really grow much. What's helped me is that full range of motion. It helps a ton and it works really well. So focus on things like this. I'm displaying smaller numbers and I'm displaying weaker numbers, but my triceps have continued to progress. So if I was up here and progressing, but not really gaining much muscle, and when I say progress, I'm talking about strength, and then I drop down and I continue at the same progression rate, even though the numbers are much lower, I'm actually gaining muscle from that. So it's okay to drop a lift where you're doing really well and you're progressing on, because if you're not getting any gains from that in terms of muscle gains, what's the point of you doing it? Find a variation. Yeah, you might use less weight, especially at first, but you will be building more muscle in the long term using that better variation. And then an insufficient proximity to failure falls into that same boat as the range of motion one. You can continue to get stronger, staying very, very far away from failure. And this is another example of someone that's able to progressively overload and get stronger consistently over time, but you're not actually gaining muscle through it. So make sure you're training hard. Make sure you're actually pushing close to failure. And there's nuance to it. It's not one rep in reserve for every lift or whatever. There's 100% lifts where you should leave a few reps in the tank, and there's definitely lifts that you should be taking to 0 reps in reserve at minimum, if not pushing much harder past failure with partials or some type of other advanced technique. Another issue is strength progression, addiction, and greed. This becomes an issue because, again, you're pushing off the real issue within your training. Is a bank robber still rich when he knows he's going to get the money taken away in a month and he's going to go to jail? I'd argue probably not. It's a very short-term thinker. It's the same thing when you're chasing the big numbers in the gym at the expense of other things. It makes you feel good in the short term because you got to check off another box, or you got to hit your rep goal, or you got to add the 5 pounds or 10 pounds to that lift. But that's going to catch up to you when you do your measurements a month later and you're the same exact measurement, even though you think you've been progressing. So now you're just wasting time. You're just pushing the issue back because you don't want to face the issue head on right now. And that's something that you just have to get comfortable with it with your training. Not everything's going to be perfect, but the sooner you can accept things and the sooner you can learn things and hold yourself accountable for not training hard or not training properly or not continuing to learn, that's when it starts to become a little bit of an issue. This next one I'm going to steal from my buddy Steve Shaw, who has a great channel, by the way. I highly recommend checking him out. Is you go to the gym to get results. The gym is purely a place to hammer that muscle as hard as you can and get it to grow. What happens is when you go to the gym and you kind of look around, you get distracted by shiny objects, which is, say, a PR. You get distracted by that so much that you're losing sight of why you're in the gym in the first place. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with strength training in the people that are chasing powerlifting or just training for strength. This video is not for you guys. Obviously, it's a basement bodybuilding. Bodybuilding's in the name. You get distracted by this, and now you've lost sight of the goal. And your old self is like looking at you like, what are you doing over there? Get back on track. And this is where it ties into Steve Shaw. Instead of seeking PRs, seek hard sets that stimulate muscle growth. Go after hard sets. Chase hard sets. That's what's going to build you muscle. And hard sets is obviously, it's a very general term in terms of looking at it. But once you understand that a set has to be hard on that specific muscle, that's a really good baseline to actually look at how to train for hypertrophy. Another subcategory of this problem is you bias the lifts that display strength and train everything else like an afterthought. And again, this is that accessory lift mindset. When you're chasing PRs, now you think you're chasing PRs because it's the method to build muscle, but now you slowly start to bias more lifts that display your strength a little bit more. Why is squat, bench, deadlift in every program? Why is it always the first lift? Why are tricep pushdowns and overhead extensions always at the end of each session and just with low volume, random 3x10? See? So now with the programming and the programs that we make popular, we're pushing that mindset out into hypertrophy training. And that's an issue because you're missing out on what's building you that muscle. It's the volume, it's the hard sets. It's not just the top heavy strength focused program that's sold for hypertrophy. And now the fun part. So I just shat on strength training and prioritizing strength for about 15 minutes or so. What I want to talk about now is a tangible mindset. I want to give you guys a peek into my mind on how I train for hypertrophy. The first one's going to be about measuring progress. When you measure your progress primarily through strength, you're incentivizing yourself to prioritize strength in your training because that's what's tied in with your reward for making progress. When you measure your muscles, say with a tape measure or progress pictures, you incentivize stimulus for muscle growth, and you can use strength as a secondary method of accountability. And I like to be diverse. I don't like to go all in on one method, so I measure in a few different ways. Measurements, strength progression in the log books, technique, clips, stuff like that, body weight, progress photos, all that kind of stuff. That's all going to be important. Diversification is key. The problem is we start to bias the strength numbers way too much because everybody can track it, everybody can do it, and it's easy for content creators to talk about. It's easy for someone like myself to say, oh, well, just go get stronger, and it kind of works, but it's kind of half-assed and not completely true. It's difficult, and it's not fun to go out and measure in all these different ways because it's not quite as rewarding, but it works better. When I used to track all my lifting just through my strength numbers, you bet that I biased the lifts that I was good at. So I was biasing my strengths and hiding my weaknesses, and then I optimized those lifts to display my strengths. And I cut the range of motion, and I started to make very fast, very good progress. And I was adding hundreds of pounds to my deadlift, squat, and bench, and I wasn't really getting any bigger. And this doesn't just apply to those lifts. This applies to the lifts that are good, because something like a tricep push down, I treat it as an afterthought. I thought all you had to do was just push down and just go to failure and hope that works. And since it didn't have anything to do with my deadlift that I was putting all my eggs in one basket for, I stopped getting bigger, and I was just wasting time doing the tricep pushdowns because every set was like a warm-up set with no stimulus. So when I started measuring my muscles and I started measuring my arms, my true thoughts about lifting and building muscle started to surface. I was like, shit, yeah, there's no way bench is going to build my arms that well. What actually will build my arms well? And that was kind of a turning point. And it's not just measuring arms. You can do this measuring any muscle. But when you start to look at it that way and hold yourself accountable with measurements too, now you're incentivizing the most stimulus you can get. You're incentivizing hard sets. You're incentivizing learning technique, training hard, good effort, good proximity to failure. Maybe you'll start picking up some advanced techniques and balancing your training out when you measure each muscle group. That was a game changer for me in terms of mindset. That's something that actually is a tangible variable that you can implement to make better gains. It's very, very legit. Another thing here, to go back to the progression, you can't out-progress slow muscle growth. You can't do it. Stop being greedy and allow your progress to happen naturally. Like I said earlier, I think the pinnacle of hypertrophy training is knowing exactly what works for your stimulus, understanding and refining those variables to build the most muscle you can over time. Eventually, you don't have to rely on the logbook. You can just look back at your training. And I'm not saying everybody can just do this instantly. It's a learning curve, but it's worth it because that's what's going to take you to the next level and build you the most muscle possible. You're no longer dependent on that happy medium of just getting stronger and taking half the gains because you know it should work, versus actually learning the most you can about building muscle and getting 100% of the gains and refining that, even though it's a little bit more complex. It is worth it, trust me. The last one here, the fastest way to progress is to make each set as stimulative as possible. Make each set hard. Go expose your weaknesses. Do the lifts that suck. Like a plat squat, those aren't fun, but they build the shit out of my quads. And this is just a random anecdote. I was looking at my quad in the mirror, and I'm mind blown at how well that worked. Just plat squats for the past 22 weeks or however long I've been doing them. It's wild. When you actually put a muscle to failure, I'm doing my working sets with 195. I used to rep out 405. My quads were smaller then than they are now. And it's because I was hiding my weaknesses before, and now I'm exposing them. My knee is bending like crazy. My ankle is touching my butt at the bottom of the squat. My chest is upright. My knees are forwards, and I'm going until my quads literally cannot move anymore. And shocker, I'm growing more from that, right? So things like this, and this is actually, this is, if I've had one takeaway from Athlete X, my favorite thing he said was get comfortable getting uncomfortable. I think that's the best way to describe hypertrophy training. So if there's one thing we've learned from that guy, get comfortable getting uncomfortable. It's gonna hurt. Lean into that pain. You want to dive into that. The way that I view it, and this is what kept me going when I was a beginner. When it starts to hurt and it's getting uncomfortable and you're really digging into that muscle, that's what I call getting in the groove, getting into that sweet spot. And once you're there, hang out, push it hard, stay in there as long as you can. And that's what's going to build you muscle. So when you can kind of develop a mindset like that, you'll start to get bigger. So that the last 5 minutes, 6 minutes of this video, take those tangible aspects of my mindset and implement those into your training. I guarantee you it will work. So with that being said, that's all I got for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will see you within the next 2 to 4 days, most likely.